All right, so let's get right down to things. I'm sorry I'm late. I've been running around like a crazy woman all day today. And when the real book tour starts, I'm going to be a lot more sporadic than I have been even up till now, just so you know. And that's, we got a little bit of time left, but just have that on your horizon. Okay, so let's start today with a couple of things, and then I'm going to tie them all together in a bigger way. And first of all, I hope you know that today is voting day in Ohio. And what's happening in Ohio is a bellwether for the 2024 election, but it is also, I think, a larger story of what's happening in America. And that is, as you know, that the Republican Party really banked for a long time on turning out voters with the promise that they would overturn Roe versus Wade, but they never intended to overturn Roe. They were chipping away at it, but they knew that most Americans from the very beginning have liked Roe versus Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that recognized abortion care as a constitutional right. Well, when Trump's three judges overturned Roe versus Wade with Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health last June, in June of 2022, what that did is it dumped a whole lot of problems into the Republican Party in its ability to turn out voters. So let me just do a little bit of an aside here. One of the asides is that, if you remember, they very quickly switched to the idea that there was something called critical race theory in schools that parents should protect their children from. That was a made up threat. And then they have turned on LGBTQ people really violently and really over the top. The idea that LGBTQ people are, as they say, groomers. They are trying to whip up another kind of cultural issue on which they can rally their voters. And you see this everywhere once you are aware of it. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole now necessarily, because I want to go back to the problem that Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health dumped into the lap of the Republican Party. And that is that most Americans, and that's not me sort of being vaguely, oh, most Americans, polls will all show you that I believe it's north of 70% of Americans want abortion to be legal in some cases. And very, very few Americans, under 20%, want them to be illegal in most cases. And I don't have those numbers in front of me. So as I say, once again, these are all times and temperatures are approximate when I do these webcasts, because I don't do them with notes for the most part. And I don't have any notes today. So the problem that means is that if you were trying to turn out your voters by promising you were going to overturn Roe versus Wade without really intending to do it, what happens when you do overturn Roe versus Wade? Will your voters still turn out? And there's real concern that they won't. That, in fact, this is one of the reasons that the Republican Party has had to drum up these issues, these fake issues, to get people outraged enough to turn out. Is it working? Partly. But the other side of that overturning of Roe versus Wade with the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision is that it has entirely fired up Americans who thought that Roe versus Wade was secure. Because remember, there is this principle in American law that once something is on the books, you try not to rock it. You call it settled law, and you try to leave it intact, because you don't want a society to be whipping back and forth between one set of judges and another set of judges. There is a legal concept that the law is discoverable, and that as you discover it, you tweak it, but you don't overturn it. And in the times when you do overturn it, as with the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, which overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896 that accepted segregation, the Brown versus Board of Education decision said, no, 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 that's unconstitutional. And when that happened, there was a huge public push explaining why this was the right way to go. They didn't just overturn it and then say, this is the way it's going to be. The way, for example, Samuel Alito has been doing from his position on the Supreme Court lately. So the overturning of Roe versus Wade has energized abortion rights activists. And that is, as I say, not necessarily activists, but probably more than 70% of Americans actually want there to be reproductive care and abortion being part of that reproductive care. So how does this play out? Since the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there have been 5 or 6 special elections having to do with abortion. And in each of those elections, people seeking to expand abortion access have won, even in deep red states like Kansas. So this presents a real problem for the Republican Party. That is, Americans want abortion care. And a majority of Americans want abortion care. And once that was overturned in June of 2022, those Americans are turning out to vote. They're much more energized than those who are happy because they got Roe versus Wade overturned. So this is all about Ohio now. So what's happened in Ohio is, on the heels of all these special elections that where the forces of people who want to preserve or expand abortion care have won, in Ohio, it certainly looked as if the people who wanted abortion care would be able to add to Ohio's fundamental law, that an amendment to the Ohio Constitution that would protect abortion care. And the Republicans, who have a super majority in Ohio, as I recall, certainly have a majority in Ohio, said no. I'm sorry, in the Ohio legislature said no. We don't want there to be this kind of protection for abortion rights in Ohio. So what they did is they said, we're going to hold a special election in August. Now, usually nobody shows up for a special election in August. That was a very deliberate attempt to keep voting energy down. And we're going to have a special election in Ohio. And in that, we're going to say that you cannot amend the state constitution with the 50% amendment rule that's on the books now. We're going to make it 60%. So we're going to change the way that you amend the Ohio Constitution to say that, in fact, in order to do it, you have to have 60% of the people, not just 50% of the people, but 60% of the people to do it. And they advanced that argument by saying, oh, it shouldn't be easy to change the state constitution. But in fact, it's not that easy. The state constitution has not been changed that often. And the times it has been changed, only a very few of them have had a majority of more than 60%. So what they then admitted was that they were doing it solely to make sure that the majority in the state that wants abortion care can't make that part of the law. So what this attempt on today's vote was to make sure that even though a majority of people in Ohio want protection for abortion rights, that they wouldn't be able to get it by manipulating the system. And so one of the things, and there've been a lot of hanky-panky about voting and when people can vote and all that in Ohio to try and make it so that rule about amending the Constitution won't pass. And it's unclear right now how that's going to come out. There's cases you can make on both sides, but it's a really, really important vote, an important vote, because of three things really. First of all, it says that it's a question of whether or not the Republicans can wiggle around with the mechanics of our system enough to get their will in order to protect their anti-abortion stance. But more generally, what it says is whether or not it's going to be possible for this minority, this political minority, to impose its will on a political majority. And that, of course, is the larger story of everything that's happening in America right now. Is it going to be possible for a political minority, that is this radical right, to impose its will on the rest of us? And if so, how is it going to happen? What are the pieces that are going to make it happen? So what's happening in Ohio right now has kind of shocked everybody in that the numbers of people turning out to vote are huge, even though it's a special election, even though it's in August when most people aren't paying that close attention to politics. People who've turned out to vote, they're huge numbers. And but there's funny things going on in terms of the counting of those ballots, which may affect the outcome of the numbers in Democratic regions, for example, where theoretically, not theoretically, you're only supposed to, it's complicated, never mind, but you're supposed to only vote in one place per county. And that means there are few, it's way harder to vote in Democratic counties, which have many more people in than it is to vote in Republican counties. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to suppress the vote that are very much in play in Ohio right now. But the reason people are looking at it is because if this is possible, it's not just about abortion, even though the issue is abortion in this particular amendment. The idea that the people in Ohio are not going to be able to amend their constitution, essentially not being going to be able to amend their constitution, is a really big deal. What it says is that the people who are currently in control will be able to affect the mechanics of democracy in the state of Ohio in such a way that the majority can't change things unless they are a supermajority, which you can see how that plays out in places like the Senate, because essentially that the filibuster enables a minority to stop things unless the other side is a supermajority, which is pretty rare in American politics. So that's what's going on in Ohio, and the reason that people are watching that Ohio case as strongly as they are. All right, so I wanted to set things up with that, because that larger question of the relationship between a majority and a minority ruling us is the story of what is at the heart of American politics today. And all of the things that I'm going to be talking about now having to do with the indictments against former President Trump and the other people who've been swept into his orbit are that exactly. The question of whether it is possible for a minority, a political minority, it's important to remember when I'm talking about minority in this discussion, I'm going to be talking about a political minority, not necessarily a racial or an ethnic or a gender minority, but a political minority. Is it going to be possible in a 21st century democracy for us to lose that democracy to a minority that has managed to gather the strings of power into its own hands in a way, for example, like happened in Russia in the 1990s under Russian President Vladimir Putin, or like as in Hungary is a more recent example, where Hungary, which had been a democracy, had the strings of power and democracy gathered into the hands of Viktor Orban, who has advanced what he calls illiberal democracy or Christian democracy, which is actually different than the Christian democratic parties in some countries. But the idea of, they basically say, liberal democracy, which is what America has, is obsolete. We need to get rid of the idea that everybody is treated equally before the law. We need to get rid of the idea that everybody has a say in their government and put a small minority of people who think correctly in charge of everything else. Is that going to happen in America? So what is at stake with the Trump indictments on the January 6th charges, not the classified document charges, which I'll get to if I have time. What's at stake with January 6th is whether or not it was all right for the then President Trump to pressure the people at the levers of our democracy to throw out the Democratic votes that were cast primarily by racial minorities. If you look at where he wanted to throw out votes, those were Black Americans for the most part. Is that okay if it's a way for that minority to stay in power? And it is horrifying the number of Americans who think it is okay, but there are fewer of them than many of the news stories are suggesting. That is, you've heard repeatedly that Trump being indicted would only help his numbers. That is not true. The polls suggest that is not true. But that's the story that is being put forward. So when, for example, Trump lawyer John Eastman did a series of interviews recently where he came out and he changed his previous story, which had been that the attempt of people like him to issue false slates of electors that argued that Trump had won elections that he had in fact lost in key states of Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, states like that. At first he tried to insist that in fact this was just a way to make sure that the election had been legal, had been on the up and up, and it hadn't been fraudulent. But now he has come out and said, no, we were trying to overturn the government because the people voting for Joe Biden were not legitimate. They shouldn't have had to say that the Democrats are going to destroy America, and it was our duty to try and keep the country safe from those illegitimate voters, from those people who were going to destroy America. And that's a really, really interesting concept. The idea, as people like Eastman and others are arguing, especially on the Fox News channel, that it's okay to try and stay in power over the will of the voters if you think it's better for the country, is actually the exact same argument that radical, racist, unreconstructed Democrats made in the American South after the Civil War, where they frankly admitted that they were losing elections. But they said, I don't care if we're losing elections because the people who are voting, in this case for the Republicans, are illegitimate and they should not have a vote. So we are actually being good Americans by cheating. That's the way one should operate. And of course, they were able to maintain that position in the American South until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act that said, no, 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 no. In fact, when we say democracy, we actually mean that people get to have a say in the governments under which they live. And with luck, that will mean that the laws will treat people equally because people will elect individuals who will make sure that those things are the case. So we're testing that proposition again. And it is interesting to me that even though people like me have seen the parallels between the Reconstruction era and the present, that Eastman was channeling the same kind of language rather than simply hiding it and saying, oh, no, we were just testing, the way he said initially. He is now actually using the same language that people used in, for example, 1898, when there was actually a coup in Wilmington, North Carolina, that overturned a duly elected government with the argument that we don't care if they were duly elected, and we know they won the vote, but we don't care because they shouldn't have been voting anyway. That's interesting to me that at this point they're simply openly using that language. And that's what's at stake here, is that if in fact a president can simply say it's important to the country for me to stay in power, how exactly is that different than Vladimir Putin? And the answer to that is it's not. So that's what's at stake across the board in the contests that are going on right now in states like Ohio today, and in the country more generally, over whether or not what former President Trump did to try and keep himself in the office of the presidency was legitimate or illegitimate. And I will say quite openly that I believe it is illegitimate, that in fact democracy means that we have transitions of power and we don't always get what we want. That's kind of the whole point of it. But we believe that we have enough chance to move the needle our way that we continue to participate in the system. And in this case, I think what you're seeing is people who supported Donald Trump in 2020, not in 2016. 2016 was a different kind of election that I don't really have time to go into today, but I'm happy to someday if somebody wants to. I've talked a lot about it. But in 2020, I think what you saw, and since then what you've seen, is the recognition among a political minority that they do not have the numbers any longer, and yet they are rejecting that reality in favor of the fact that because of their beliefs, they have the right to rule over everybody else in the democracy. And that's a position of rigid ideology that is basically a non-starter in the long term, but it can cause an awful lot of havoc in the short term. And it's also really important to remember it is a position of weakness. For all that it looks like right now, people who are backing people like the former president, that they're in positions of power, you don't need to take over the system if you have a majority behind you. When you feel comfortable with your power, you don't have to try and consolidate it because you know you've got it. So everything that's going to happen from now on, always keep that in mind. It's the people who are like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. You go ahead and turn out as many voters as you can. Those are the ones who know they have a majority. It's the people who are like, no, 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 you can't vote and you can't vote and you can't vote and we're going to do this. They're the ones who know they can only win if they cheat. All right. So if that's the case, let me get into, I'm going to talk about some other stuff here. And if you want to throw some stuff in the comments here, I'm happy to try and pick them up. I'm kind of all over the map today because I've been doing a lot of stuff. All right. So what's going on? You asked about these Trump indictments and what is going on with the different judges and how should we think about them? All right. Let me just start with a place that seems like it is worth Alice, I see that, and I'll try and work that in. I'm going to make a point on that. So one of the things that I want to say about all the Trump indictments is I always talk about lanes. There's a legal lane and there's a political lane. I am not a lawyer. So when I talk about the legal lane, what I can tell you is what I read from people who are lawyers and who have good reputations. But I am not a lawyer. And one of the things I have a real weakness in is I can tell you what happened, but I sure can't tell you what's gonna happen, because in that you need legal training to be able to say, oh, if you move these 3 chess pieces, there's the 4th. I don't have that. And you should listen to lawyers about that. What I can do is tell you what did happen, because I'm really good at reading stuff that happened in the past and saying, oh, this move does this and this move does that. So there's the legal lane and then there's the political lane. That's my lane. And when we talk about Trump's indictments, it's always going to be important going forward to recognize that there's a legal lane and that there's a political lane, and that those two things are not necessarily the same. And that's not necessarily a distinction that a lot of reporters understand, because the two are going to intersect in weird ways. So the first thing I'm going to say about the Trump indictments is this: they are going to be exhausting. So lots of stuff happened over the weekend, but for most of us who aren't lawyers or who just want to sort of see the high points, I would not get into those weeds. They're very available. You can always look them up. But the bottom line is that, and if you care, I can outline them for you. I'm going to write that down, Kevin. But that what all that Trump has right now, certainly in the national security documents case and in the January 6th case, is to delay it. He has openly said to some people who have reported it in the New York Times that he is planning, his plan is to be reelected and get pardoned. Either pardon himself or make sure somebody's in that office that can pardon him, because at this point, the legal cases against him look really bad. And one of the things that he wants to make sure of is that especially the January 6th indictments, but the others as well, don't get litigated before the election, because they make him look bad. And people are going to react to that, as they did to the hearings of the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. People saw that. They watched it and they were horrified. So he is trying desperately to make sure that stuff doesn't go forward. And this is, I'm in my political lane here. He's going to delay. Everything is going to be a delay. He's going to challenge every teeny tiny little thing to try and draw it out so that it doesn't come up before the election. And it's going to be maddening beyond belief. So if you're interested in following the twists and turns, I really recommend Joyce White Vance's newsletter, where she untangles it every night. And I'm afraid I'm blanking on the name of it. And I do subscribe to it. I think it's linked off my Substack. Civil Discourse. It's called Civil Discourse. But it's going to be maddening. It's going to be every time you turn around and you think, oh, this time we're really going to have some news by this date, his lawyers are going to drag their heels. Now, that's going to play out in with this attempt to keep things from going forward is going to make everybody bananas. So I'm not going to be writing about it every single night, because it's going to make us all, jump off a cliff. But it's important always to remember that that is political. He is politically trying to delay things so he can get back in office or get somebody back in office who will pardon him, because he doesn't think he's got the legal standing for it. So he's kind of throwing, at least it looks to me like he's throwing the legal case overboard, in the sense that, over the weekend he put a bunch of stuff on Truth Social that was really inflammatory and really appeared to go against the arraignment conditions he had for the January 6th case. But what's he doing there? I mean, is he just having a psychotic break? Maybe that's what some people said, but maybe he's trying to taint the jury pool so he can get the jury pool kicked out of Washington, D.C., which he's making all kinds of noises about and is unlikely to happen. But it's important to remember that that's not a legal strategy so much as delay, which is a political strategy. So that brings up then the next question that you all asked, and that's about these two judges. There's Judge Eileen Cannon in Florida, and there is Judge Chutkan in Washington, D.C. And they're very, very different judges, which is going to be interesting. Eileen Cannon was confirmed after Trump lost the election. Interesting, considering Mitch McConnell's position on confirming judges too late in the game. She is very inexperienced. She made a lot of mistakes in a lot of trials, and she seems pretty clearly to be working on Trump's behalf. I actually think it would be very interesting to look quite deeply into how she got that appointment when she did. But she appears to be working being the ref. She's working the books as hard as she can to give Trump those delays and to undermine the other investigations that special counsel Jack Smith has in order. So one of the things that she did, maybe it was yesterday, I'm sorry, I always lose track of modern time, was to say that she was not sure it was at all appropriate for Smith to have grand juries operating in Washington as well as in Florida, where she is, on the question of Trump's theft of national security documents that bore classified markings. And again, I'm not a lawyer. She says she doesn't think that's right for them to do. People who are lawyers say that's ridiculous, that you can charge a crime wherever it's committed and wherever there are aspects of it. And of course, the taking of the documents happened in Washington. The storage of them happened in Florida, and that should be able to go forward. It has raised the question of whether or not she can be challenged as a judge, because she apparently told tales out of school by admitting there were these other grand jury investigations going on. I'm not going to comment on that. Not a lawyer, just reporting the news, in that case, not adding to it. But that is going to come up against Chutkan, who is, I believe, an Obama appointee who has been very hard on the January 6th perpetrators who've come in, for defendants who've come in front of her, saying that this is not okay, that you can't behave this way. And Chutkan has a reputation of being a very good, very solid judge who was confirmed unanimously by the Senate, for all that Republicans are now saying she was a plant. In fact, they confirmed her unanimously, and has a very solid reputation. So what is this going to mean if Eileen Cannon manages to delay the national security documents case? That'll mean the January 6th case goes forward more quickly. It's unclear how those things are going to play out. I would urge you to remember that there are still other things in play as well. There is a case against the Trump Organization, which is really going to matter because that's how Trump has managed his financials in the past. And that looks like it's a fairly strong case there in New York, although, again, not a lawyer. And there's also the fact that there are potential other cases hanging out there, including the case against Trump in Georgia for trying to get Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to throw out all the votes that gave gave Biden the victory in the 2020 presidential election in Georgia. Worth remembering, of course, that they only challenged the presidential election, even though there were other elections on those same ballots that they never challenged. So that's worth pointing out as well. All right, so that's what's at stake with the Ohio and the Trump indictments. And I've gone over the Trump indictments a number of times to explain what they were. So I don't think I'll do that now unless somebody says they would like me to. But let's take a look now at some other cases where these things these same questions have recently changed and why they changed. So on August 1st, I believe it was, the majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court changed from being a majority Republican to a majority Democratic Supreme Court. And this matters a lot. So it matters because like the special election in Ohio, what seemed to be, to many of us on the outside, to be a local election that, you know, whatever they're going to do with the Supreme Court in Wisconsin is up to the people in Wisconsin. Well, it matters a lot because the Supreme Court in Wisconsin had been upholding severely gerrymandered redistricting. And with the replacement of right-wing justice with Janet Protasiewicz, who has said, we got to take care of these crazy redistricting maps, Wisconsin now has a real shot at getting rid of the extreme gerrymandering in that state, which has meant that the state house and the Wisconsin delegations have been on the right, while the statewide elections have put Democrats in office. If in fact that changes, if in fact Wisconsin redistricts back to fair maps, not ones that give Democrats an advantage, but just fair maps, because right now it's virtually impossible for Democrats to win a majority in the Wisconsin State House because of the gerrymandering and the redistricting in that state. If that's the case, and if in fact fair maps go into place the way they did in Wisconsin, which changed the entire tenor of Michigan, which changed the entire state government of Michigan last year, that means that Wisconsin has a chance now to become a much fairer state, and one that in fact might turn back into the Democratic column for things like its electoral votes. So that's another case where a local election, in this case, the election of an individual onto the state Supreme Court, might very well have national repercussions. And in this case, it's repercussions that I particularly like because I don't like gerrymandering anywhere. I think that that's kind of cheats, basically, no matter who does it. Somebody asked, by the way, I'm going to throw an aside here about the fact that that Texas is defending its gerrymandering by saying they're political gerrymanders and not racial gerrymanders, and therefore they're okay. It's going to be interesting to see if they get away with that. The Supreme Court has suggested it would accept political gerrymandering, but at the Supreme Court level, but that state courts can in fact readjust that in a way that was one of the cases that just came up through, in a way that the Republicans didn't want them to be able to. They wanted to say that the state legislatures could do whatever they wanted and the state courts couldn't do anything about that. And the recent Supreme Court case said, no, that's not the case, that the state courts can say, no, you can't do this. Right now that's being challenged in Alabama, where the Alabama state court said, you've got to fix these ridiculous partisan gerrymanders, and the state legislature said, screw you, we're doing it anyway. And that's what's going on in Alabama right now. In Wisconsin now, it looks as if that is being addressed. And also, it's worth taking a look, I think, at what just happened in Tennessee, where in a special, again, another set of special elections, the two Justins, as they are known, part of the Tennessee Three, who were thrown out of the Tennessee out of the Tennessee legislature for supporting gun safety protest, were thrown out by the Republicans, have just been reelected in their own special elections to sit back there, although they have not been returned so far, as of this morning, I don't believe, to their committee assignments. And that's another example where the Republicans were on tape saying this is a fight for, we got to protect our way of life, and all the sorts of things that a minority insists when it grabs the majority. But that the people said, no, these are our representatives, we want to have them back. So a lot of this is all in flux right now. But one of the things that is really interesting for me as a historian is to recognize that it's not any longer all going one direction. That in fact, a lot of Americans have woken up and are saying, this is not This is not, I'm going to put down Tuberville here too, by the way, you wanted to hear about. This is not what we want and what we think of as being the way American democracy should operate. So on that front, I want to give you a couple more. I'm watching quietly here the comments coming through, and one of the things that somebody has asked about is why on earth is Tommy Tuberville, which, by the way, I know I keep mispronouncing as Tuberville, but doesn't it look like it should be Tuberville? I mean, it's a tuber, but okay, which is like a potato, right? Or a orchid. Anyway, Tommy Tuberville, I understand, is putting a hold on military appointments, which is, I'm sorry, frankly, appalling. That you know, our whatever you think about the military budget and whatever you think about our policies, our military is literally what protects this country. And the idea that one senator is simply refusing to allow promotions through is mind-boggling. How is he able to do that? He is able to do that, and I've said this to somebody, I don't think I said it on this recently. The Senate has always had itself a real problem, and that is that it's small. And the problem with that, and I'm not suggesting it's a problem with the system, I'm suggesting that what that means is that the House of Representatives grew very fast, very quickly. Of course, the framers, had no concept that the country would grow as big as it did, as fast as it did. And what happened is that the House of Representatives had to come up with ways to get people to stop talking, for example, and ways to make stuff happen, even if you had a recalcitrant minority. And so the House put rules in place, or preserved rules, to move debate along, for example, that the Senate simply didn't bother to do. So, for example, all a filibuster is the fact that the Senate never developed a way to make people stop talking. The House did, but the Senate didn't. So in order to get people to stop talking, you got to go through this long process called cloture, and you need to have I think it's 2/3 of the vote of the Senate to make that happen. Oh, come on. Like, the House has a system, the Senate does not. And what that means is that somebody can stop legislation through a filibuster simply now by saying, I'm going to filibuster that. So until you get a filibuster-proof majority, you basically can't get anything through the Senate unless they have arranged a workaround, which they have for judicial appointments, for example, and for defense funding and for a couple of other things. But in the case of Tuberville, the other thing that the Senate has done is that because you can't stop people from debating, they tend to move things that are not controversial through the Senate without taking votes. They move them through by something called unanimous consent. And what that does is it just clears the calendar. So in the case of the State Department, for example, or which Rand Paul had a hold on, or the Defense Department, what that means is that there is a logic of promotion where people are pretty obviously going to step into that next post. So when Rand Paul, for example, was stopping the appointment of ambassadors, including one to Niger, so what finally made him back down was the fact that there was a military takeover. We're not legally calling it a coup yet, at least as of this morning we weren't. Maybe we are now, I don't know. But once we call it a coup, we can't intervene financially any longer. So there's a military takeover on the 26th of July, and we didn't have an ambassador there because there'd been a hold for so long on our ambassadors. So he allowed non-controversial ambassadors to go through by unanimous consent the day after, and we got a whole slew of ambassadors, including to places like Jordan and Niger, and major positions that were bonkers that we didn't have people there. But Tuberville is refusing to let military promotions, uncontroversial military promotions, go through by unanimous consent. So what he's saying is that it is possible to get those through, but you're going to have to go through every step of every channel all the way in order to do them one by one. And if the Senate does that, it will never be able to do anything else, and it still will not get through all the ones that are on hold. So what he's doing is using the old-fashioned rustiness of the Senate to keep people out of our military positions. And that's a really big deal. Now, they're acting people in those positions, but what does that say in critical places that the United States does not have confirmed leaders in those positions. And other leaders have to leave either because they're term limited out or because their positions end at a certain time. And you don't want military leaders to be able to stay in office forever. I will say that somebody said to me, there's this rumor going around that he's doing it to hold those positions open. And I think, considering that that has been a tactic of the Republicans, especially Mitch McConnell, to hold a Supreme Court position open for Donald Trump to fill, that's how we got Dobbs overturned. I think it is a mistake not to recognize that if in fact Trump's wish goes through, that he gets reelected, that all of those positions will come up for him to fill. I think that to say, oh, that couldn't possibly happen at this point is naivete, simply because they've done it before. Now, are they doing it or not? I don't know. I'm not on those discussions. I would hope not. But I think saying, oh, that couldn't possibly happen, those days of being able to say, oh, that couldn't possibly happen are long gone in this country. I think we have to assume anything could happen. And of course, Tuberville was one of the key plotters with Donald Trump for the January 6th attempt to overturn the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. All right. So you asked me about Tuberville, and you also asked about the move to impeach President Biden. And that, again, is an attempt to keep the waters muddy and to make sure that one of the things that's really going on, well, actually, let me talk a little bit about that, because I intended to talk about it before I decided today to talk about majority minority. So one of the ways in which the current Republican Party is trying to keep its voters and also to destabilize our democracy is by trying to indicate that all politicians are corrupt. It's not just Donald Trump, that they're all corrupt, and that Joe Biden is the worst of the bunch. And I just want to emphasize here that not all politicians are corrupt. Right now, the politicians who are corrupt are Republicans. And there's a structural reason for that. It's not because people wake up in the morning and say, hey, I'm corrupt, I'm going to become a Republican, although some do. It's because in any system where one political party does not have sufficient oversight by another political party, you're going to get corruption because it's too easy to look the other way and to hide things. And you see this, for example, with what recently happened in Ohio, where there's been the leader of the Republican House, as I recall, and the leader of the Republican Party in the state both were convicted of felonies because there wasn't enough power on the side of the Democrats to create real oversight that voters could react to. So whenever there is a one-party system where one party can basically do whatever it wants and no one listens to the other party, then you're going to get corruption in that major party. And you can see that in old-fashioned Democratic states as well as in Republican states nowadays. So but that's not to say that all politicians are corrupt. They are not. Politicians are the same as everybody. And for all that, I might not like the way certain politicians behave, that doesn't mean they're corrupt. And it is a huge stretch in my mind to argue that President Biden is corrupt for this reason, because he's a Democrat who came up through a period in which the Republicans were looking for anything they could find on the Democrats. If they had something on Joe Biden, don't you think they would have used it by now? Which is exactly why Trump was trying desperately to manufacture something on Biden in Ukraine by working with people in Ukraine and trying to drum up something about Burisma. Now you're seeing them go after Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son. And I just like to emphasize that when we talk about Joe Biden's son, he's not a child. He's 53 years old. You hear about this, he always feels like, oh, they're going after his 24-year-old son who lives, no, he's a grown man. He's a grandfather, for God's sake. Pretty sure anyway. Anyway, in any case, he's a grown man. His children are grown. They're going after Hunter Biden, I think, for two reasons. One, to try and indicate that there is a Biden crime family. There's no Biden business. unlike the Trump family, where there literally is a Trump business, which is currently getting ready to go to trial for shady business practices. That's the case in New York. But they're trying to bring this idea that all politicians are corrupt and that they're going after Biden for his character. And they're doing it entirely by innuendo. So it was really interesting last week. They kept talking, and including people like House of Representatives leader, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican from California, keeps saying, oh, we've got this guy, Devon Asher. He's got all this information. Devon Archer, I'm sorry. We got all this information on how corrupt Biden is. He's their key witness, all this sort of stuff. Well, he in fact testified behind closed doors, and it was really interesting because they released the transcript just as the indictments for Trump came out, pretty clearly trying to hide them, at least it seems so with the timing. And they said, look, it proves everything we said. Well, I read them. I sat down and I read all 145 pages of them. Less daunting than it sounds like, because there's a lot of white space, when someone just answers no or whatever. It doesn't say anything like that. In fact, he said, I never saw Biden do anything illegal. He was not involved in our business discussions. We never had business discussions with him. What he said happened was that, in fact, Joe Biden called his son Hunter every day, which would make sense because if you look at the timing, that's when Beau Biden was sick and dying. And, that it seems like that's not a bad thing. That's probably a good thing. And that when he called, he would, when Senior called Junior would sometimes put him on speakerphone if he was at dinner and say, hey, say hi to my friends. That's it. And that's not what's coming out through the Republicans at all when they're reporting stuff. And you don't have to take my word for this. I feel like LeVar Burton. Don't have to take my word for this. Read it in a book. You can read this yourself if you're at all interested. And I was gobsmacked when I read it because I expected something. I expected a meeting or something. Wasn't there. All right. So what they're trying to do is to seed in the American mind either that Biden is corrupt, or that he has a low character. One of his great strengths is his character. Look, in that case, that was the issue of him calling one of his sons every day while his other son was dying. That does not seem to me to be a character flaw, personally. So they're trying to attack Biden's character, or to simply flood the zone with so much crap, you stop caring anymore, and you say, they're all corrupt and I'm not going to have anything to do with this. So the move toward impeaching Biden is an interesting one because the far right really, really, really wants to impeach Biden. They really feel like, hey, you've told us repeatedly you got all this stuff, because they're kind of painted themselves into a corner. We've got all this stuff. He's the most corrupt president we've ever had, et cetera, et cetera. If that's the case, then impeach him, right? It only makes sense. But they actually don't have anything. So they're kind of in this caught between a rock and a hard place, in that in order to continue to feed their base, they have to say, we've got this everything on him. But the truth is, once somebody like Archer is under oath, he's got nothing. So now there's this real pressure to impeach Biden to keep this issue in front of the public. At the same time, it's going to be very hard to do that and to hold hearings where people are under oath and then have them produce anything that's actionable. So you've already seen today Mitch McConnell trying to step back and say, we shouldn't use impeachment frequently. It's not a good thing. We're setting a bad precedent. Not saying we don't have anything, but rather trying to back off of that. And it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they go forward with that. All right, somebody asked me to talk about the black mayor who was elected in his town and was simply locked out of the office, and the white guys who'd been ruling forever stayed there. I'm afraid I don't have that right in front of me. I did read that first when it happened, and that is a classic example of exactly what I was talking about before in places like Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, what's known as the Wilmington coup. I've written about that in my West from Appomattox, but there used to be, anyway, a good website that you could look at that had newspaper articles from the time where people said, hey, we're the good members of society, therefore we have launched a coup. You know what? I should write about that. It's really interesting, the parallels in the language. But you can just Google it. It's called the Wilmington Coup, C-O-U-P, of 1898. All right. So this brings me to another thing that you asked me to talk about here at the end, and that is Why are Biden's numbers so low if, in fact, things are as good as economists are saying about the economy? And this speaks to a number of things. But first of all, let me start with this. What I think I've said before, I was not Team Biden when we went into 2020. And I thought at best he was going to be a caretaker president. And I fully admit that I was wrong. His presidency has been transformative. It is going to be in the history books as one of the most important in our history. Whether or not it's successful is not clear, but certainly he has made huge changes in our country. And one of the most important changes, of course, I'm very interested in what's going on overseas. I'm not going to talk about it now. I don't have time for that. But what he has done is he has thrown out the concept of supply side economics that has driven American politics since 1981. And that is a really simple idea. That is, the demand side of the economy are people like you and me, I assume, people who are workers who are providing demand in the economy for consumer goods, who need jobs, who are the majority of us. And then there's the supply side, and the supply side are those people with capital who are I'm trying to do this in economic terms, who are economic drivers in the sense that they have the capital to invest in new economic enterprises. So after World War II, before World War II, after the great crash of 1929, when Americans elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933, he says, listen, we got to stop simply turning the government over to the rich and letting them decide how this economy runs. And in the New Deal, he came up with a deliberate attempt to create an economy where the government regulated business, so not too much capital concentrated at the top, where workers had rights, where there was a basic social safety net, where the government invested in infrastructure so that people like me would have broadband, which I don't currently. Not broadband in those days. In those days, it was electricity. And later on, they're going to add civil rights to that. And that idea was enormously popular between 1933, and I would argue still, but that was the ideology that presidents of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, operated under until 1981. And in the election of 1980, Americans elected Ronald Reagan president with the idea that you didn't have to fix society that way because it cost tax dollars, which it does, but that in fact you could get all of those benefits with what he called supply side economics. That was, stop trying to help the demand side, stop trying to help workers, stop trying to help consumers, stop trying to protect civil rights, stop trying to invest in infrastructure. Instead, focus on the supply side. Make sure that you cut taxes so that people at the top have more money that they can then invest more efficiently in the economy. Get rid of regulation so they can run their businesses however they want. Get rid of the things that cost tax dollars so that money would concentrate at the top. And that, according to Reagan's economists, that supply side economics would be a much more efficient system that would create such a thriving economy. You wouldn't need stuff like civil rights legislation because everybody would have so much money they'd get along a lot better. And the economy would be much more efficient because you wouldn't have the mess of bureaucracy that makes it hard to do things like put electricity in or cable TV or whatever. And that getting rid of business regulation would make businesses much more efficient and cheaper, and you'd get rid of the bureaucracy, and you wouldn't really need much of a social safety net. To the degree you would need one, it could be provided by churches and by private social enterprises. That idea was always a theory that never paid off in real life. And what we've seen since 1981 with that attempt, increasingly of both parties throughout the period from 1981 to 2001, what we've seen is just this rush of money to the top of society and a much lower standard of living comparatively for those of us on the demand side. Biden reversed that. He said, supply side economics doesn't work. We've proved it doesn't work. So I'm going to go ahead and recreate the kind of economy that we had in the period until 1981, except I'm not going to make it white-centric the way it always has been in the past. I'm going to focus on children, which is going to mean that rather than focusing on white men as breadwinners or as men as breadwinners, I'm going to try and make sure children are protected, which means we're also going to make it easier for women to enter the workforce with childcare, for example. Not something that's happened yet, but that's what he argued. And we're going to push the recreation of the demand side, what he keeps saying, rebuilding the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, which somebody said today in one of the major newspapers. What does that even mean? And I'm like, what that means is the New Deal, folks. So he has done that. He has reoriented the economy, and the media has said this won't work, this won't work, this won't work, and they've been predicting a recession since the beginning of the attempt to do this. And in fact, the economic numbers are spectacular. Unemployment has been at the lowest rate that it has been, since the 1960s, and at the growth is way up. All the things that the people under FDR said would happen are in fact happening, which is one of the reasons that there is such concern, I think, on the part of people who don't want that kind of an economy. It's actually working. Does that mean everybody is great? No. I mean, I got a furious note the other day saying, my healthcare isn't good. Well, no, but it's better than it was, or if it's not, it's something that is being worked on, simply because this ideology says if we want to have an upwardly mobile society and a healthy, stable society, we need to focus on the demand side rather than the supply side. So Biden has done that, and it has been a raging success. Growth is high. The gap between the rich and the poor that developed over 40 years. In the first 2 years of his administration, a quarter of that was wiped out for the people at the very bottom of the economy. They made gains that wiped out, 25% of what they had lost got restored in 2 years. Now that's not going to continue because we've lost things like the child tax credit, but that's a transformative moment, and it's one I think that the media couldn't see, in part because they weren't accustomed to understanding the different kinds of economies that were on the table, but also in part, I think, because since Watergate and since the Vietnam War, I think our default is to say the government sucks. It can't do anything right. And one of the things that I think has been remarkable, and to my mind really got its first articulation with Alexander Vindman in the 2019 impeachment hearings, was the idea that government can work, that the US government can be a force for good, that it's not something that we necessarily just want to tear down the way the supply side economics people and the Republicans have wanted to do since 1981, that in fact the government is good. It protects clean water, it protects clean air, it tries to make things better for the vast majority of people. But that's it. But if you come out in our country today and say, I like what this government is doing, it's a very vulnerable position to be in, because here's a newsflash: the government doesn't do everything right. There are plenty of things the Biden administration does that may not be the right things, but the media is not used to saying, oh, this is good. So rather than taking a look at the fact that our economic growth was off the charts, they tended to focus instead on inflation. And when inflation started to come, which was problematic, but when inflation started to come down, all of a sudden it stopped being a story, even though this economic system has brought inflation down in the United States more significantly than in any other developed economy. That's a big story. So I think that they just didn't have the muscles to say, hey, wait, this is going well. They have started to do that. There's been a change in the last several months where major papers, including places like Forbes, have said, hey, wait a minute, the economy is really good. And Biden did something really good there. And similarly, they have focused increasingly on Biden's protection of NATO and the fact that Trump wanted to get out of it. And again, as I've said before, imagine what this world would look like if Trump had been in power when Putin invaded Ukraine and NATO had not held, if we'd pulled out. I mean, we'd be looking at a really, really different world. So if the media is not covering what is going well with the Biden administration, so what is the answer? Well, the answer to that, I think, is twofold. One is that just because it isn't in the New York Times does not mean it's not happening. So I've pointed you before to places like Red Wine and Blue, to places like my Facebook page. The people like you are great. I mean, look, we're all coming together as a community. And that's just two out of the very many places you're seeing organizing and the exchange of information that is not showing up on necessarily in some of the major papers. But what does that mean going forward? I think that what happened in Wisconsin with the election of Janet Protasewicz, what happened in Tennessee with the reelection of the Justins, what's happening in places where people are saying to each other, not, hey, you suck because you belong to whatever party, but where they say, listen, I believe in free and fair elections. You know, I believe that everybody should be equal before the law, whether it's a former president or whether it's a young man running away from a police officer in fear and gets shot. I mean, I don't care where you stand on anything. I don't want police officers, one of whom is one of my dearest friends, to be the judge and the jury. That's not how our system works. And I think that in this moment, if you are interested in participating in politics in a daily way, the answer is, as I've always said, to take up oxygen, not necessarily by being in people's faces, but by saying, hey, we're actually doing something about climate change. Isn't that great? The Inflation Reduction Act has made our largest investment in ameliorating climate change that we've ever had. Turns out a lot of people don't know that, which I find shocking since I write about it as much as I do. But when people say, oh, we're not doing anything about climate change, we're probably not doing enough about climate change. But the Biden administration made huge strides in that direction. Vice President Harris has worked across the country to protect reproductive rights. She's worked across the country to protect the right of equality before the law. Biden has been out there trying to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. There's all kinds of stuff going on that's actually good. And if it's not being touted in the newspapers, which I don't suspect it will be, because there is this sense that if you talk about good things, you are somehow a shill for the administration, which I don't think is fair, actually. It's not going to come out there, but there's nothing that says that people like us who are not affiliated can't say that. And although inevitably you get back, well, this isn't happening. Well, of course not everything is being fixed overnight because it took us a long time to get into this hole. But the more I look at the 1970s, for example, and what our economic numbers looked like in the 70s and our racial justice numbers looked like in the 70s and the direction we were going in the 70s, and I look at how denigrated that was in the 1980s, quite falsely, with people simply making stuff up, the more I think we really could get back there, and get back there in a much better way than we were before, by moving forward to a more just and a fairer society, especially in this moment where on the one hand, we are facing the rise of authoritarianism around the globe, but also here at home. But on the other, the reality of what it will mean not to address climate change has got to be in the forefront of everybody's mind, in the United States at least, which is what I talk about, but around the globe. It's kind of now or never. And while that is a terrifying thought in a lot of ways, it also suggests that we have the wind behind us and in our sails. And to that end, we got a year to convince people that democracy is worth it. That doesn't mean you're going to get your way all the time. I'm not going to get my way all the time. But that restoring the systems of our democracy in a way that it's fair, that Democrats can win elections and Republicans can win elections and maybe other parties can win elections if we do things like adopt ranked choice voting. that's worth preserving. So at the end of the day, even though you're going to hear tons of crap about what the latest thing is that Trump's lawyers have done, and even, there's going to be so much coming at us for the next year. Somebody said to me today, I can't read your letters right now, I'm overwhelmed. Terrific. Take time off. We'll need you in the game at the end, but it's fine to go kayaking or play in your garden. But for all that stuff's going to come out and come at us, I'd sure rather be on the side protecting democracy in this moment than I would like to be on the side attacking it, because history says we will win, and history says that this is the way that we have the best chance of achieving a just and fair society. Never done it yet, but this seems like the best way to get us there in the end. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I will write tonight, and I will see you next week. I think is a clear day. Thanks for being here.